Gang targets fat black woman unaware husband is a former Navy SEAL. Maria had always been a woman who wore her heart on her sleeve. She had never let her weight define her, even though the world often tried to. At 32 years old, she had faced her fair share of judgments, but she had never let them break her. Her life, while not filled with riches or fame, was one that many could relate to. Simple, steady, and full of hard work. Maria spent most of her days working at a local diner, a job she loved. It gave her the opportunity to interact with a variety of people, serve them with a smile, and go home knowing she'd made someone's day a little brighter. Her diner, Ellie's Eatery, was a warm and cozy little place nestled in a quiet part of the city. The booth seats were the perfect shade of red, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee always filled the air. It was here that Maria had met her husband, James. She'd been serving him his morning coffee for weeks before they ever spoke more than a few words to each other. James had come in every morning, a man of few words, his expression always calm, but there was something about him that stood out. Maria had always been a little cautious about men, especially ones who seemed too perfect. But James wasn't like that. He didn't try too hard to impress, and he didn't ask for anything other than a cup of coffee and a seat by the window. It wasn't long before Maria realized he was different, and it was that difference that had caught her attention. Over time, their conversations had grown from casual pleasantries to deeper talks about their lives, their struggles, and their dreams. James had a quiet confidence about him, and Maria admired that. His life wasn't easy either. He had served in the military for years, though he hardly ever talked about it. He had a way of brushing off questions about his past, always changing the subject or giving a quick, nonchalant answer. Maria had come to accept that, understanding that there were some things James simply didn't want to discuss. But despite his silence about his past, there was no doubt in Maria's mind that James was someone she could rely on. He made her feel safe, something she hadn't experienced often in her life. Maria had grown up in a neighborhood where she had to watch her back, especially as a black woman in a world that often treated her as less than. The constant looks, the judgments, and the snide remarks were something Maria had learned to live with, but they still hurt. She had grown up knowing what it was like to be overlooked. Her family didn't have much. They were a family of hard workers, doing everything they could to survive and make ends meet. Maria was no different. Her life was one of quiet resilience. She'd never expected to be a star, but she had always wanted to make a difference. Working at the diner gave her a sense of purpose, even if it didn't pay well. She had always dreamed of something more for herself, but dreams were hard to chase when life kept throwing obstacles in your path. James, though, made her feel as if anything was possible. He was supportive of her, patient with her, and always made her laugh when she felt down. She had started to imagine a life with him, a life where she wasn't just surviving, but thriving. Maybe, just maybe, she could be more than the woman who served coffee in a diner. Maybe she could do something bigger with her life. One chilly autumn afternoon, Maria was working her usual shift when she noticed something was off. A group of men had entered the diner, loud and rowdy, looking like trouble. The leader of the group was a tall man with a sneer on his face. His eyes scanned the room before settling on Maria. There was something in his look that made her skin crawl, but she smiled anyway, as she always did when greeting a customer. "Coffee," the man barked. Maria nodded. Turning to fetch the coffee pot, she could feel his eyes on her as she moved, and it made her uneasy. As she poured the coffee, she couldn't help but notice how the man and his friends kept looking at her, whispering to each other, making her feel like she was a target. She dismissed the thought quickly. Maybe they were just strangers passing through, no different from any of the other patrons. But there was something about their energy, something in the way they moved and talked that made her uncomfortable. Over the next few days, the group returned. They didn't cause any trouble at first, but it was clear they were watching her. Whenever she was near their booth, they would exchange whispers and laugh under their breath. Maria tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but it lingered. Her instincts told her something was wrong, but she didn't want to make a fuss. She didn't want to be the paranoid woman who saw danger in every stranger. One evening, as Maria was closing up, the group of men walked in again. This time they didn't sit at their usual booth, but at a table near the back, out of sight of the counter. It was almost as if they were planning something, though she couldn't tell what. They seemed different that night, more aggressive, more focused. The leader gave her a nod when she walked by, but his gaze was colder than before. Maria's unease grew. She had always been able to tell when something wasn't right, but she had never been the type to let fear control her. She wasn't going to let a few troublemakers ruin her evening. But as she walked toward the counter to grab the last of the cleaning supplies, one of the men, another from the group, approached her. He was tall, with tattoos creeping up his arms, his face expressionless as he stepped closer. "Got a minute?" he asked, his voice low. Maria paused, her heart picking up pace. She had a million things running through her mind, but she knew better than to show fear. She forced a smile, her voice calm even though her insides were starting to churn. "Sorry, I'm just about to close," she said, keeping her tone firm. "Can I help you with something?" The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gave her a long, unsettling look. Maria felt a chill run down her spine. Before she could turn away, he reached out and grabbed her arm. "Don't ignore me," he muttered, his grip tightening around her. Maria tried to pull away, but the man's hold was strong. Her breath quickened as panic crept in. She knew this wasn't just a casual encounter. The man's friends had gathered in the background, watching her. They were closing in. "Let go of me," she said, her voice shaking now but still determined. "I said, let go." The man smirked and tightened his grip, pushing her back toward the booth where the others were seated. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest as her mind raced. This was not just some rude customer or a misunderstanding. She was in real danger. Suddenly, she felt a hand on her shoulder. It wasn't the man, but someone else, someone much stronger. "Is there a problem here?" Maria turned to see James standing behind her. His expression was calm, but his body was tense. His eyes locked onto the man's hand, still gripping her arm. For a moment, the diner fell silent. The man let go of her arm and stood up straight, his eyes narrowing as he sized up James. Maria could see the hesitation in the thug's eyes. He had thought he was in control, but James was a presence that couldn't be ignored. "What's going on here?" James asked again, his voice steady but firm. The group of men looked at each other, unsure of what to do next. But before they could make a move, James stepped forward, his presence overpowering, and the atmosphere in the diner shifted. The tension in the air was palpable, but Maria wasn't sure what to make of it. The gang had been hanging around for the past few days, lingering near the diner, whispering among themselves. They hadn't caused any major problems yet, but something in the way they looked at her made her uneasy. She had brushed off her instincts, convincing herself she was just overthinking things. But now, after what had happened last night, Maria couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in her gut any longer. The next morning, as she walked into the diner for her shift, she felt a strange heaviness settle over her. The diner was quiet, just like usual, but today there was an unfamiliar chill in the air. It wasn't cold, but Maria couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the empty booths. Her footsteps echoed on the linoleum floor as she moved to the counter. James hadn't been around much lately. He had been working late shifts at his new job, something that still felt unfamiliar to her, though she never asked about it. She didn't question him, knowing he was always there when it mattered. But even though he was always just a phone call away, Maria couldn't help but feel a sense of isolation when he wasn't there. The thought gnawed at her as she filled the coffee pot and set the cups on the counter. The door chimed as it swung open, and Maria glanced up, expecting the usual morning crowd. But instead, it was them, the gang. They had come in again, and this time, they weren't just sitting in their usual spot near the back. They walked in with an air of purpose, heading straight for her. The leader, the man who had grabbed her arm the night before, flashed her a wide, unsettling grin. Maria stiffened but forced herself to smile back. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline that was quickly building in her veins. "What can I get for you today?" The leader didn't answer right away. He scanned her face, then looked over his shoulder at the others in his group. They were hanging back, not making a move, but they were watching her closely, their eyes narrow and full of menace. The group had grown in size. There were now 6 of them, all leaning in, crowding the entrance. Their presence felt suffocating, and Maria's nerves tightened. "Same as always," the leader said, his voice low and mocking. "Coffee and some food." "We're hungry." Maria nodded, moving to the coffee machine. She was doing her best to keep her hands from shaking. She had a choice here, to try and ignore them or to confront the feeling that was building inside of her. The latter didn't seem like a good option, so she focused on her work, her back turned to them as she filled their cups. But just as she reached for the sugar, One of the men from the group leaned in, a low chuckle escaping his lips. Maria felt his breath on her neck and her stomach lurched. She didn't turn around, not wanting to give them the satisfaction of knowing they were getting to her. Instead, she focused on the task in front of her, trying to ignore the heat of his gaze. "You know," he said softly, "I've been thinking. You sure do look tasty." Maria stiffened, her hands tightening around the handle of the coffee pot. The words struck her like a slap to the face, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a surge of panic. She was used to crude comments from people, but this felt different. This was something darker, something with ill intentions behind it. Her instincts screamed at her to turn and walk away, to hide, but she couldn't. She had to face this head-on. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze for a brief moment before speaking. "Keep it to yourself," she said, her voice steady but filled with a warning. "I'm just here to do my job. If you're not here to eat, you can leave." The man didn't flinch, but his grin widened. The leader, seeing the interaction, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Maria couldn't understand why they were so fixated on her. She was nothing special, just a woman who worked at a diner and happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The man at the counter reached forward and grabbed a napkin, slowly wiping his hands. "You're tough, huh?" he said, leaning closer. "But you can't hide from the real world forever, sweetheart. People like you, they don't last long." Maria felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The words hung in the air, making her stomach twist. There was a deeper threat lurking beneath the surface of his casual words. They weren't here just for food. They weren't here for anything normal. Maria didn't know if they were here to intimidate her or to send a message, but it didn't matter. She knew deep down that they were testing her. "Get out of my space," she said sharply, her tone no longer friendly but firm. "I'm not scared of you." The leader laughed, a low, guttural sound that made Maria's blood run cold. "You should be." He motioned for his group to move toward the back, but the man who had been speaking to her stayed behind for a moment longer, his gaze never leaving her face. Maria held her ground, refusing to let him see the fear she felt creeping into her chest. The gang might have been just another group of troublemakers, but there was something about them, something that made Maria's senses scream that they were dangerous. As they finally left, Maria exhaled in relief, though it was short-lived. The threat was still there, lurking like a shadow over her every move. The sense of unease gnawed at her throughout the day. She knew they were only getting started. She was wiping down the counter when the bell above the door rang again. This time it was James. He walked in with his usual quiet confidence, the weight of the world seemingly off his shoulders. His expression softened when he saw her, though he could tell something was wrong. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice low. Maria glanced at him, a flash of hesitation crossing her face before she smiled, forcing herself to seem calm. "Just the usual. Some guys were giving me trouble earlier, but it's fine." James frowned, his eyes scanning the room, his attention shifting to the door. He had always been observant, noticing the smallest details that most people overlooked. He could see that something was off, that there was more to the story than Maria was letting on. "Don't let them bother you," James said, walking over to her. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, a gesture of comfort that immediately put her at ease. "If they try anything again, let me know. I'll handle it." Maria nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. She wanted to believe that everything would be okay, that the gang was just a group of loudmouths who wouldn't cause any real trouble. But deep down she knew that this wasn't over. She had no idea what they were planning, but she had a feeling that things were about to get much worse before they got better. As she stood there, her hand resting on the coffee pot, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change. She didn't know how or when, but she knew it was coming. The calm before the storm had arrived, and she was bracing herself for the chaos to come. The days blurred together, and with each passing hour, Maria's unease only grew. The gang was back as expected. They didn't come in every day, but every time they did, their presence seemed to grow more ominous. It wasn't just the way they looked at her or the crude words they whispered behind their hands. It was the feeling that she was being watched everywhere. Every time she stepped out of the diner, there they were, hanging around the corner, lurking in the shadows. Maria had tried to brush it off, but she couldn't. She told herself they were just bullies, nothing more, nothing less. It didn't matter that they were bigger, stronger, and meaner. She had survived her entire life by fighting through harder things. She wouldn't let a few lowlifes intimidate her. But deep inside, something told her this wasn't just a random act of harassment. There was more to this than she understood, and the longer it went on, the more it felt like it was spiraling out of control. James had noticed, of course. He was never far behind her. Even when he wasn't physically around, he checked in often, always asking if everything was okay. She lied each time, not wanting to worry him. She was used to carrying the weight of her problems alone, not wanting to seem weak. But that day, as she walked into the diner, Maria knew it was different. The diner was empty when she arrived, just as it had been the last few mornings. But something about the silence felt wrong. The usual hum of the coffee machine, the soft clinking of plates, everything felt muted, as if the world outside had faded away. She set her bag down and started to prepare for the morning rush, wiping down the counters and preparing the coffee pots. But there was a nagging sense of dread that refused to leave. The door chimed and Maria looked up, expecting to see the usual early bird customers trickling in. Instead, it was the gang, this time with an additional man in tow. The leader stepped inside first, followed by the rest of his crew. The new guy, tall and muscular with a cold, emotionless expression, stood just behind them, scanning the room as if measuring the space. Maria's stomach turned. She had seen enough to know that something wasn't right. The gang had changed. They weren't just here to harass her anymore. This was something different, something far worse. The leader gave her a slow, deliberate smile as he approached the counter, the other men following his lead. They moved in a way that was calculated, like a pack of predators moving in for the kill. Maria's heart began to race, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Good morning," the leader said, his voice casual but filled with underlying menace. "Coffee like usual?" Maria nodded, trying her best to keep her voice steady. "Of course. Coming right up." She turned to the coffee machine, her hands moving faster than usual, but in the back of her mind she was already plotting an escape. She needed to get out of here. She couldn't face them alone. She glanced around the diner. It was quiet, too quiet, and the only other person in the room was the new guy. He was watching her, his eyes cold, calculating. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. Just as she was about to pour the coffee, one of the men at the counter leaned forward, resting his arms on the edge. "You know, we've been talking," he said, his tone casual but carrying a dangerous edge. "You're a pretty girl, Maria, but you don't know your place. You're a bit too big, don't you think?" Maria flinched at his words, but she didn't let it show. She had heard worse in her life. She had learned to tune out the cruel remarks, the jabs at her appearance, the insults disguised as compliments. But this time it was different. There was an aggression behind it that she couldn't ignore. It wasn't just about her looks anymore. It was about control. "You don't know me," she said, her voice low and steady, though her pulse raced in her ears. He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "No, but we're getting to know you, Maria. We're going to make sure you understand your place, whether you like it or not." Maria's mind raced, but she kept her face neutral. She couldn't let them see how scared she was. She reached for the coffee pot, trying to act as normal as possible. Her hand shook slightly, but she steadied it before she began to pour. "How much longer are you going to keep up this charade?" the leader said, cutting through her thoughts. "You don't belong here. You're nothing more than a joke." Maria's stomach churned, but she wasn't going to let them get to her. She forced herself to breathe deeply, her fingers gripping the coffee pot tighter than necessary. She could feel the eyes of every man in the room on her, watching her, waiting for her to break. But just as she was about to respond, a voice broke through the tension. "What's going on here?" Maria turned quickly, relief flooding her chest as she saw James step into the diner. He was dressed in his usual work clothes. Simple, but it was the confidence in his stance that caught everyone's attention. The gang's leader didn't immediately react, but the man standing closest to James shifted uncomfortably. There was a brief moment of hesitation, but then the leader smirked. "This doesn't concern you," the leader said. "Just a little conversation." James didn't move. He simply stood there, his gaze locked on the leader. Maria could feel the energy in the room shift, and it made her heart race faster. She knew James was no stranger to conflict. He had been a soldier once, but she had never seen this side of him before. He had always been calm, measured, never quick to anger. But today something was different. "I said, what's going on here?" James repeated, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity that sent a chill down Maria's spine. He wasn't asking anymore. He was demanding. For a split second, the leader seemed to falter. Maria could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the doubt creeping into his expression. It was only for a moment, but it was enough. Nothing, the leader said quickly, a bit too quickly. We're just leaving. But the tension in the room didn't dissolve. As the gang turned to leave, one of the men lingered for a moment, his gaze lingering on Maria. It was a look that made her blood run cold. It wasn't over. They were going to come back, and next time, they wouldn't be so easy to scare off. James stayed by Maria's side until they left. He didn't ask any questions, but he didn't need to. He could see it in her eyes. She was terrified, and he couldn't stand seeing her like this, unable to protect her from the monsters in her life. "You okay?" he asked gently, his voice soft, though there was an edge to it. Maria nodded, though she wasn't sure if she was lying to him or herself. The truth was, she didn't know if she would ever feel okay again. She couldn't stop looking over her shoulder, couldn't stop thinking about what they would do next. "I'm fine," she said, but the words felt hollow in her mouth. James didn't buy it. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his fingers warm against her skin. "We'll figure this out," he said quietly, though his words held a quiet promise, one that Maria desperately wanted to believe. But deep down she knew this was just the beginning. Things were only going to get worse from here, and she didn't know how much longer she could keep pretending that everything was fine. The next few days felt like a blur to Maria. The feeling of dread had settled deep in her chest, gnawing at her, refusing to let her rest. The gang hadn't returned in full force, but their presence lingered. Every time Maria stepped outside, she felt the weight of their eyes on her, the creeping sensation that they were watching, waiting for something. It wasn't just the usual intimidation anymore. This was something darker, something more dangerous. James was quieter than usual, too. She could see the concern in his eyes whenever he looked at her, but he didn't press her to talk about it. He was waiting, letting her open up when she was ready. But Maria didn't know how to explain it. How could she tell him what she didn't even fully understand? The gang wasn't just bothering her, they were playing a game, and Maria was caught in the middle of it. And she had no idea what the endgame was. It was on a cold Thursday evening that the situation finally came to a head. Maria had just finished her shift at the diner and was walking home, her bag slung over her shoulder. The streets were quiet, too quiet, with only the occasional car passing by. She hurried her pace, eager to get home, but as she passed a dimly lit alley, she heard footsteps behind her. It was almost instinctive. Maria's body went rigid, her heart pounding in her chest as she quickened her pace. The footsteps matched her stride, closing the distance between them. She didn't dare turn around. If she did, it might give them what they wanted. The power to make her afraid. She glanced up ahead, seeing her apartment building in the distance. Almost there. She pushed herself faster, praying she would make it without incident. But just as she was about to pass the alley, a hand shot out from the shadows, grabbing her arm with an iron grip. Maria gasped, struggling to free herself, but the man's hold was unrelenting. She looked up to see the leader of the gang standing in front of her, his face twisted into a smirk. The others were hidden in the shadows, but she could feel their presence, looming, waiting, circling. Her breath caught in her throat, panic flooding her senses. "You really thought we'd just leave you alone?" the leader said, his voice low and mocking. "You're not getting away that easily." Maria tried to pull away, her heart racing. "Let go of me!" she shouted, her voice trembling with fear. "You don't want to do this." The leader's grin widened. "Oh, I think we do. You've been a problem for us for too long. It's time you learned your place, Maria." With a forceful shove, he pushed her back against the wall of the alley, his hand tightening around her wrist. Maria's vision blurred as she fought to stay upright, the rough stone digging into her back. She could hear their laughter, the men in the shadows egging each other on, taking pleasure in her fear. Her pulse pounded in her ears, and she struggled against the leader's grip, her mind racing. But then, just as she thought it couldn't get any worse, she heard a voice, a familiar voice, calm but full of anger. "Let her go." Maria's head snapped toward the entrance of the alley, and there, standing like a rock in the doorway, was James. His presence was a force that seemed to freeze the air around them. His body was tense, his posture straight, but his eyes were like steel, locked on the gang leader with an intensity that made the world go still. The leader hesitated, his smirk faltering for just a second. But then with a chuckle he looked back at Maria. "Your husband's here to save the day, huh? Think he can take us all on?" James didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He just stepped forward, his gaze never leaving the leaders. "I'm giving you one chance," James said, his voice calm but filled with an unmistakable authority. "Let her go now." The gang leader's grin slowly faded as he sized James up, his eyes flicking to the men behind him. There was a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze. James was different from anyone they had faced before. There was something in his stance, something that told them he wasn't just another man trying to protect his wife. He was someone who had seen things, done things that they could never understand. But the leader wasn't ready to back down. "Not yet, you think you're the tough guy?" He sneered, stepping closer to James. "I've got a lot of friends. You think you can take all of us?" Maria's heart was racing, but in that moment something inside her shifted. She had spent too long hiding, pretending things were okay when they clearly weren't. She had been letting herself be a victim, letting them dictate her life, but no more. Her eyes locked onto James, and for the first time in a long time she felt a surge of strength rise within her. She wasn't the weak woman they thought she was. She wasn't afraid anymore. "James," Maria said, her voice steady now, "I can handle this. We can handle this." The words hit her like a revelation. She wasn't helpless. She wasn't trapped in this nightmare. She had a choice, and she was going to take it. The gang leader scoffed, but Maria stepped forward, her feet planted firmly on the ground. "You're nothing but a coward," she said, her voice loud and clear. "All you've done is harass me and my husband, but we're not scared of you anymore. So if you're here to fight, then fight. But don't expect us to back down." James stood beside her now, his body relaxed, but there was a fire in his eyes. He didn't need to say anything. His silence spoke volumes. Together they were a force that none of them could ignore. The leader glanced at his men, who were shifting uneasily. The tension in the alley was thick, suffocating. For a long moment it felt like time had stopped. Then finally the leader let out a long sigh and stepped back. "This isn't over, Maria," he said, his voice filled with venom. "We'll be back." Maria's pulse was still racing, but she stood tall, unflinching. "You're welcome to try." The leader scowled, but with a final look at James, he turned and motioned for the rest of the gang to follow. The sound of their retreating footsteps echoed in the alley as they disappeared into the night. Maria exhaled slowly, her legs shaky, but she stood firm. She turned to James, her eyes meeting his. "I don't know what's going to happen next, but we're in this together, right?" James nodded, his expression softening. "Always." Maria's heart swelled with a sense of gratitude, but there was something else too. Something deeper. She had just taken a step toward something bigger than herself, toward reclaiming her power, her life. And it felt good. It felt right. Together they walked back to their apartment, the weight of the night slowly lifting from their shoulders. The fight wasn't over, but Maria knew one thing for sure. She was no longer afraid. The night after their confrontation in the alley, Maria couldn't sleep. Her mind raced, replaying every moment of that terrifying encounter. The gang had backed down, but the feeling of danger lingered in the air like a thick fog that refused to dissipate. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint noise outside their apartment made her jump. She kept telling herself it was over, that they had made their stand, but deep down Maria knew it wasn't over. The leader had promised they'd be back, and somehow she knew he would keep his word. James, however, seemed unbothered. He lay beside her, asleep, his breathing steady, his face relaxed. Maria envied him for his peace of mind. She wanted to close her eyes and drift into a world where everything was safe, where she wasn't constantly looking over her shoulder. But that world felt like a distant memory, slipping further away each day. It wasn't just the gang that bothered her. It was the way her own life had shifted in the past few days. How everything that had once felt secure and normal was now tainted by fear and uncertainty. Maria had always been a woman of routines, of steady work and quiet determination. She had never asked for attention, never sought out confrontation. But now she was thrust into a world where every decision felt like a fight, and for the first time she didn't feel like she was in control. The soft sound of James's breathing filled the room, pulling her thoughts back to the present. She turned to face him, watching the way his chest rose and fell in the quiet of the night. He looked so peaceful, so calm, like the world didn't weigh on him the way it did on her. It made her wonder how he did it, how he could carry the weight of his past and still be here, still be present for her. And then there was her, She wasn't strong enough to push past her fears, to ignore the lurking danger that she felt with every passing minute, but she had to. She couldn't let this consume her, couldn't let it define her. As dawn's first light crept through the curtains, Maria rose from the bed, careful not to wake James. The house was still too still, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. The gang wasn't going to let this go. They were coming for her, for them. She went to the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly as she made a cup of coffee. She didn't want to face the truth, but she had to. James could protect her, yes, but he couldn't be everywhere. She had to be strong, too. She had to stand up for herself. She wasn't a victim, and she wasn't going to let anyone make her feel like one. As she sipped the coffee, Maria's thoughts wandered back to the first time she had met James. He had always been so quiet, so unassuming. He had been the kind of person who blended into the background, who never drew attention to himself. But there had always been something about him that stood out, something unspoken. And in that moment, Maria realized that James wasn't just calm or controlled. He was a protector. But she couldn't lean on him forever. She had to protect herself, too. By the time James woke up, Maria had already gotten dressed and was making breakfast. He didn't ask why she was up so early or why her expression was so serious. He knew. "Ready for another day?" he asked, his voice soft, still thick with sleep. Maria smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Ready as I'll ever be." They ate breakfast in silence, both lost in their thoughts. James didn't push her to talk, but he watched her closely, as if he could sense the storm brewing inside her. Maria could feel the weight of his gaze, and for a moment she wanted to tell him everything. Tell him about the fear, about how she didn't know how much longer she could handle this, but she kept it inside. She couldn't burden him with that. He had enough on his plate already. After breakfast, they both went about their day. James had work and Maria had the diner. The minutes stretched into hours, and with each passing moment, the feeling of impending danger grew stronger. Every corner Maria turned, every shadow she passed, seemed to hold the promise of something bad. The gang wasn't done with her, and she couldn't keep pretending it wasn't true. It was late in the afternoon when the gang finally returned. Maria had just finished serving a table when she saw them through the diner's front windows. They were walking down the street, their movements slow, deliberate. Maria's heart skipped a beat and a chill ran down her spine. They were coming for her. She knew it. She looked around the diner, but there was no one else in sight. The usual crowd had been sparse that day, and now it was just Maria. She could feel her chest tighten, but she refused to let fear control her. She had to face them, had to stand her ground. She wiped her hands on her apron and moved toward the door. But as she reached for the handle, the bell above the door rang and the gang stepped inside. They weren't just here for a cup of coffee this time. They were here for something else. The leader locked eyes with her, his grin wide and predatory. The others filed in behind him, filling the diner with their menacing presence. "You thought we'd just forget about you?" the leader said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're ours now, Maria, and you'll learn your place." Maria's breath caught in her throat, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't going to back down. She couldn't. They had been pushing her for too long, and now it was time to fight back. Before she could respond, the door behind her opened and James walked in. His eyes immediately locked onto the gang, his expression hardening. There was no mistaking the tension in the air. The gang saw James and their attitude shifted. They were used to intimidating people, to making others feel small. But James wasn't like the others. He wasn't afraid. "You should leave," James said, his voice low but carrying enough authority to make the leader pause. The gang leader sneered. "What are you going to do about it?" Without a word, James stepped forward. He wasn't fast, but his movements were precise, each step measured, his body coiled with readiness. The gang leader took a step back, and for the first time a flicker of doubt crossed his face. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected James to stand his ground. The others in the gang exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to do. They had been expecting an easy win, but they hadn't anticipated the quiet strength of a man who had faced far worse than they could ever imagine. "Leave," James repeated, his voice unwavering. Maria felt a surge of adrenaline rush through her veins. She wasn't standing on the sidelines anymore. She wasn't going to let James do all the fighting. She stepped forward, standing beside him. "We're not afraid of you," Maria said, her voice strong. "You've pushed us too far and it ends now." The gang leader's expression darkened, but for all his bravado, he knew he was outmatched. The tension in the diner was palpable, and in that moment Maria felt a rush of power. She was no longer the victim. She was in control. The gang hesitated, looking at each other, sizing up the situation. One by one, they backed off, muttering under their breath as they slowly retreated from the diner. The leader was the last to leave, his eyes locked onto Maria and James before he stepped out into the street, the others trailing behind him. Maria stood frozen for a moment, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She had done it. She had stood up to them, but more than that, she had taken control of her own life. The fear that had gripped her for so long was finally starting to loosen its hold. James turned to her, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You're stronger than you know." Maria met his gaze, her heart swelling with gratitude and pride. "We're stronger together," she said, her voice steady. As they stood there side by side, the weight of the moment sank in. The fight wasn't over, but they had won this battle. And no matter what came next, Maria knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let fear define her anymore. Maria hadn't expected the silence to feel so loud. After the gang's retreat, after the words of defiance, she had thought the world would somehow feel different. Lighter, maybe. But there was no escaping the reality that it wasn't over. They had won a small victory, yes, but the battle was far from done. The threat wasn't gone. It was just waiting, lurking in the shadows like it had always been. Maria knew that, but for the first time in a long time, she felt an unfamiliar weight lifting from her chest. The fear, while still there, no longer had the same grip on her. She had stood up. And in doing so, she had reclaimed a part of herself she thought she had lost forever. James hadn't said much when they returned to their apartment that night. He didn't need to. The weight of the day hung between them like a thick fog. He was quiet as always, but there was something in his eyes, something that said he was proud of her, but also that he was worried. There was no doubting that James was strong, both in body and spirit, but Maria could see it in the way he looked at her that night. He wasn't just worried about the gang. He was worried about her, and that realization hit her harder than anything else. They had fought together, yes, but she couldn't help feeling that in some way, this fight had been hers alone. James had done his part, but the courage she had found in herself that night, the strength to stand, to refuse to back down, had been her own. And it was a strength that would not fade. After dinner, they sat together on the couch, the tension between them still palpable but shifting, changing. Maria leaned back against the cushions, her head resting against the back of the couch, her eyes staring at the ceiling. James sat beside her, his arm draped around her shoulders in a gesture of comfort. He wasn't speaking, but his presence was a steadying force. Maria could feel the warmth of his body beside her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and it reminded her that, in this moment, they were together. They were safe, but that sense of peace didn't last long. There was always the knowledge gnawing at the back of her mind that the gang would come back. They weren't finished with her, with them. It had been a warning, a game, and now they were waiting for the next move. Maria didn't know what that next move would be, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She had taken control. She had stepped up, and she would keep stepping up no matter what. The next morning, James went to work, leaving Maria alone in the apartment. She'd gotten used to the quiet by now, but today felt different. The air in the apartment was thick with uncertainty, and Maria could feel it pressing down on her. The gang hadn't come back, not yet, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were just waiting, watching, planning. She had been through enough in her life to know that peace could be fleeting, that safety was often an illusion. But that didn't mean she had to live in fear. She decided to go for a walk. It was early, still morning, and the streets were calm, almost serene. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows on the sidewalk as Maria made her way down the street. She wasn't sure where she was going, but she needed to clear her mind, to remind herself that there was more to life than just survival. She needed to remember who she was before all of this. As she walked, she thought about the diner, about her work, about the people she had met along the way. She had always been a part of the community, even if she wasn't the center of attention. She had always taken pride in doing her job well, in being someone people could rely on, but now it felt like something had shifted. She wasn't just Maria, the quiet diner waitress, anymore. She was more than that. She was a woman who had fought back, and she had won. But victory was never permanent. The gang was still out there, and Maria knew she couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. She had to stay vigilant. They would come back. They always did. As the day wore on, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Her phone buzzed with a message from James. "Stay safe. I'll be home soon." The message was simple, but it brought a sense of comfort. He was looking out for her just as she was looking out for him. They were partners, after all. They had been through too much together to let fear tear them apart now. Around noon, Maria returned to the apartment. She was exhausted, not physically but mentally. The constant strain of living with the threat hanging over her head was starting to wear on her. She needed something to take her mind off of it. So she did what she always did when she needed an escape. She cooked. She gathered the ingredients for her favorite dish, fried chicken and collard greens. It was comfort food, food that reminded her of home. As she cooked, she let herself sink into the rhythm of it, the sizzle of the chicken in the pan, the sound of the greens simmering in the pot. It was familiar and it was grounding. The smell of the food filled the apartment, and for a moment, Maria allowed herself to forget about everything else. She focused only on the simple joy of cooking, on the warmth of the kitchen, on the peace it brought her. James arrived home just as the food was finishing, and when he walked into the apartment, he smiled at the familiar sight of Maria in the kitchen. It was a smile that reached his eyes, a smile that said everything he didn't need to say aloud. Maria returned the smile, her heart swelling with something more than just love. It was pride. She had made it through the night. She had made it through the worst of it. As they sat down to eat, Maria found herself feeling lighter, more at ease than she had in days. She and James talked about everything and nothing, the weather, his work, the people they'd seen on their walk. It was normal and it felt good. It felt like life was returning to some semblance of normalcy, even if she knew it wouldn't last forever. After dinner, they sat together on the couch, as they often did. Maria rested her head on James's shoulder, her eyes closed, and for the first time in what felt like ages, she allowed herself to relax.
James wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close, and she felt safe.
She felt like they could face anything together. But the peace was short-lived. The knock at the door shattered the stillness. Maria's heart skipped a beat and she immediately tensed. James, however, didn't flinch. He stood up slowly, his expression unreadable, and moved toward the door. Maria followed, her breath quickening. The knock came again, louder this time. James opened the door and Maria saw them, two men standing in the doorway, their faces grim. "What do you want?" James asked, his voice steady. But there was an edge to it now. The men didn't answer right away. One of them stepped forward, his hand resting on the doorframe. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. Maria could feel her stomach drop. It was them, the gang. They had come back. James looked at Maria, his expression softening, then turned back to the men. "I don't think we have anything to say to you," he said firmly. "You're not welcome here," but the men didn't move. They stood their ground and Maria felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't over. It wasn't over at all. Maria stood frozen in the doorway, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't expected this, hadn't thought the gang would return so soon or so boldly. The two men in front of her weren't the same ones she had faced before. These were strangers, new faces, but with the same dark intent that she had seen in the others. They were here for a reason, and Maria could feel the weight of that reason pressing down on her. James didn't step back. He didn't hesitate. His stance was firm, protective, his eyes scanning the men in front of him, sizing them up with a quiet intensity. Maria could see the muscles in his arms tighten, his body coiled, ready for anything. There was no fear in him. There was no panic. Just calm, controlled power. "We don't want any trouble," James said, his voice low but firm. He wasn't backing down, not this time. One of the men, the taller one with a scar running down his cheek, smirked. "Too late for that," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "We're not here for a chat. We're here for you, Maria." Maria's blood ran cold. The word struck her like a slap, but she refused to let them see her fear. She wasn't going to be intimidated. Not anymore. She had fought back once before and she would do it again. "What do you want?" Maria asked, her voice steady, though she could feel the anxiety building inside her. "We've already told you to leave. You don't belong here." The taller man stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can stand up to us?" He sneered. You think you're safe just because you had a little victory? We're not done. Not by a long shot. James stepped in front of Maria, blocking her from their view. His eyes never left the men. You should go, he said again, his voice almost a whisper, but with such authority that the words felt like a command. Now! The men exchanged a glance, their faces unreadable. The tension in the air thickened, crackling like static before a storm. Maria could feel her heart in her throat, but she refused to look away. She wasn't going to let fear control her again. She had made it this far. She had stood tall before, and she would do it again. The man with the scar looked at his partner, then back at James. There was a brief moment of hesitation, just long enough for Maria to catch her breath. But then the man's lip curled into a sneer. You think you can take us all on? You're nothing but a coward, he spat, stepping closer. James didn't flinch. He didn't move. He didn't need to. The gang might have thought they had the power, but in that moment James had control. Maria could feel it. The shift, the subtle change in the energy around them. They were no longer the ones in charge. They weren't the ones who could make demands. But then, the taller man's smirk faded, replaced by something darker. You really want to play this game? He asked, his voice now cold, almost predatory. He stepped back, signaling to the other man. Get them. Maria didn't see it coming. One moment the two men were standing there, their eyes locked on James, and the next, everything happened in a blur. The men lunged forward, but James was faster. In one swift motion, he dodged the first man's attack, his body moving with the precision of someone who had been trained to fight. The taller man swung again, aiming for James's chest, but James blocked it, his arm moving with practiced ease. He countered with a quick, sharp strike to the man's side, forcing him back. Maria's heart raced as she watched, her instincts screaming at her to do something. She wanted to help. She wanted to run, but she couldn't, not now. This was their fight. This was her moment, too. She had been pushed to the edge, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. The second man advanced on her, but Maria was ready. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the nearest object, a heavy vase on the nearby table, and swung it at the man's head with all her strength. The vase shattered on impact, but the man staggered back, his face contorted in pain and surprise. It wasn't a move she had planned, but it was exactly what she needed. James was still engaged with the first man, his movements swift and precise. He had the upper hand, but the second man was regrouping, his eyes filled with fury. Maria didn't wait for him to strike. She lunged forward, grabbing a nearby chair and using it as a shield. She swung it at the man's legs, knocking him off balance. He fell, hitting the ground with a thud. The sound of the struggle filled the room, but it wasn't just the noise of a fight. It was the sound of Maria and James fighting together, fighting for their lives, for their future. The gang members were no longer in control. They weren't the ones who could dictate what happened next. With a final, decisive move, James grabbed the taller man by the collar and slammed him into the wall. The man grunted in pain, but James held him firm. This ends now, he said, his voice low and controlled. You're done here. The second man was still on the floor, groaning, unable to get back up. Maria stood over him, her breath shallow, but her expression hard. This was the moment. She had taken control. She had fought back. And she had won. The two men exchanged a look, their faces twisted in frustration and rage. They had underestimated Maria and James, and now they knew better. Slowly, they backed away, retreating toward the door. This isn't over, the taller man growled, his voice filled with venom. We'll be back. James didn't flinch. He didn't say anything. He just watched as the two men fled, the door slamming behind them with a finality that echoed in the silence of the room. Maria stood there for a moment, her body still trembling, her mind racing. But there was no fear now. There was only triumph. She had done it. She had fought for herself, for her home, for her future, and in that moment she realized that she had always been stronger than she gave herself credit for. James turned to her, his expression softening. He stepped forward, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. You did great, he said quietly, his voice filled with pride. Maria met his gaze, her heart swelling with gratitude and relief. We did it together, she replied, her voice steady now, no longer filled with fear. Together they stood in the aftermath of the fight, the room still, the tension finally broken. The fight wasn't over, But for the first time, Maria felt like they had taken control of their own destiny. The gang might have thought they had the power, but Maria and James had proven that they were unbreakable. And no one, no matter how hard they tried, could take that from them. Maria had faced her fears, and in doing so, she had found her strength. And that strength was something no one could ever take away.